Because of the popularity of Camaros, Chevelles, and Mustangs, many other companies started to put their own twist on the muscle car. As gas-guzzling big blocks began to fade away, and smaller V6 turbo engines began to redefine the muscle car in the 80s, which begs the question, what can now be considered a muscle car? The definition of a muscle car is 2 doors, 4 seats, and a large displacement V8 engine, then the list of possible muscle car options is long. We're going to be diving into muscle cars even more today, but we're not going to necessarily be looking at the popular ones.
Right.
I think if we mention Camaro, Mustang, Chevelle, any part beyond what I'm just said right now, we've lost track.
Right.
So we're going to be looking at the obscure muscle cars, some of the weird models or versions that maybe some of the OEMs have had, and also ones that maybe no one would think was a muscle car, but actually fit that definition and just wasn't maybe known for that.
Yeah. Now let's tighten this up a little bit, because I know we're talking about obscure muscle cars. So we could talk about, what was the first muscle car, which I know a lot of people think it's a GTO, but it's really, it's an Oldsmobile from 1949. You can talk about your 57 Chevy fuelie car, a 283 fuel injected car being a muscle car, but honestly, that's more of a classic cruiser. Mm-hmm. So let's just kind of get out of that stuff and just go right into the 60s, because that's when really muscle cars were starting to hit their stride. And that's when you usually talk to somebody and say, hey, muscle car. They usually say, oh, 60s and 70s.
Yeah. Either is by definition a muscle car, what we consider a muscle car, and that'll at least help navigate through, some of these more oddball, obscure models.
Sure.
So as we mentioned before, like in my opinion, I think our opinion, it's got to be 2 doors. It's got to have 2 sets of seats, 2 rows of seats, so it's not a sports car, and larger displacement engine.
Correct.
And just to double check all of that, I looked on Wikipedia, dictionary, and even Hemmings.com has, for their muscle car section, has the definition basically. Okay. So read out that, and that basically kind of affirms what we've mentioned, but also kind of gives us a little bit of a guide. So muscle cars are smaller, mid-sized.
Yeah.
American family cars.
Sure.
Keyword family cars. That means not a sports car.
2 seats.
Can't put the kids in the back.
That's right.
With powerful engines. They say preferably with 2 doors.
Ooh. And I'm sure it's because they're talking about the 90s.
And when the popularity of sedans,
yes.
performance sedan, but to me, like, those are more in the line with like a BMW, Mercedes performance luxury sedan or performance sedan.
I agree.
2 doors.
No, you have 2 doors. Let's keep it at that.
And engine's going to mostly be V8, but might have some differences here and there, especially with some of the technology, coming about that allowed the same or more horsepower in something that's not necessarily a V8, but you put that side by side to a 60s, Camaro muscle or 60s muscle car, it's going to have the same amount of power basically.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of after the fuel crisis stuff, and we'll get into that later. But for the most part, let's just talk about the ones that time forgot about. Just let's talk about an AMC car, right? Because even AMC just sounds so foreign. I mean, the company's been out of business since the 80s.
Yeah.
Right. And it was actually a conglomerate of different companies that came together. So you had your Studebaker, you had your Nash, you had, I forget the other one, but it was basically 3 or 4 different car companies that came together to form American Motors Corporation, AMC, right?
Well, and that's what's funny is like, that's the most American. I mean, that's the most American kind of standard, car company that you could get, and kind of coming out of some of the, smaller automakers that have maybe been pushed out by the big 3. So they had to, where can they compete?
Well, and the funny thing about it is the 2 most popular cars from AMC are the Gremlin and the Pacer.
So not the cars that you think of when you say muscle car.
Right. But if you are a guy from the 60s and 70s, you look at that company at the time, they were still kind of using a power plant that was very popular in the Ford market, the 390, the 390 V8. Well, they had a lot of them. So a lot of their family cars, like the Rambler that you had from the 50s, all of a sudden they had a Rambler X. You had the AMX, which is kind of a weird thing because an AMX doesn't have a back seat. It was a factory race car that they produced for drag racing. And again, too, muscle cars back then, a lot of that stuff was drag racing. Right? So I know that kind of breaks it, but AMX, it was a 12-second factory car, which a 12-second factory car in 1969.
And that's, insane. Like I said, to fit the definition, we're talking about the family car has the rear seats, but there probably were guys, and definitely were muscle car guys, probably junking that.
Oh yeah,
rear
you take
seats,
the seat out, right?
You know,
drag racing.
stripping it down, getting as much power out of it as possible. So.
Right, but you know, then also too, you look at AMC, like they had that car called a Rebel, right? And again, family mid-size car, nothing that really you'd get, you know, you wouldn't look at the thing twice if it was going down the street. Yeah, but you'd hear it.
Yeah, but it had some power.
It had power in it. I mean, if you're talking about burning tires off, it burned off tires just as good as the other ones, right? So that also too, those cars were a little bit more affordable as well, you know, because they were they were competing to be against the big three. Yeah. You know, so you look at those models and you kind of say like, wow, I've never heard of that, or I've never seen one of those. Well, there wasn't a lot of them made either. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's something that if they made 3,000 AMXs, I'd be surprised. Right. I mean, I'm sure that there's a way of looking it up, but you know, that would really make me kind of go, wow. You know, and the reason why I bring this one up too is my buddy Revo actually had one, and to me, it was an ugly looking car. It kind of looked like a cross between a Gremlin and a Pacer, honestly.
I mean, the styling is probably all going to be fairly similar,
but it was a short wheelbase, powerful car, stick shift. I mean, Revo would burn the tires on that thing every corner that he possibly could. And it was a fast car. Like I mentioned, it was a 12-second car from the factory back then. Yeah. So, nothing to mess around with.
No. And that's, I mean, yeah, you're not going to get probably that from a Camaro at the time.
Not at the time. No.
You know, or a Mustang from, you know, the factory necessarily. Right. And that's, so, you know, that's definitely probably the most obscure of the muscle cars, just because that brand
it was so small.
Is very small and not as well known as Chevy. Right. You know, but you also got to remember that a lot of them have maybe gone away in the last, you know, decade or so. But yeah, General Motors had Cadillac.
And they had a muscle car for every single one of them.
And same thing with, you know, your Dodge and your Plymouth and all that, where there's multiple different lines that maybe cater a little bit to different audiences, but yeah, they were putting a muscle car spin on all of these.
Well, here's what's kind of funny. The theory of there is no replacement for displacement, right? There's that old saying, right? The bigger the cubic inches, the more horsepower you make. Okay, if you look back, like your Chevy and your Ford and even your Chryslers, they didn't have, I mean, they had their big engines, but for the most part, like the Chevy had a 350, right? Ford had a 302.
Yeah, they weren't crazy.
They weren't crazy big numbers.
The bigger engines were in a Lincoln or a Cadillac, where you needed that more power. Right. But that's obviously what the combination of that smaller car and the bigger horsepower is what did it.
Let's take, for example, Buick.
Yeah.
Okay. Buick made the 455, you know, their big block that was in the Buick Electras.
Yeah, so your big,
huge land yacht, right? But now you got this powerful engine that now you put it into the smaller Wildcat version, and all of a sudden you've got a Buick Grand Sport, right? That's 455 cubic inches, which is bigger than even Chevy's 454.
Yeah,
right.
True.
But people that wasn't a car that they looked at for some reason. That was,
and
just
that's
not
the thing.
That
You're
right?
You know, a lot of especially the muscle car stuff. You know, your whole race on Sunday, buy on Monday, and they had like. Some Pontiacs had stuff, but probably maybe didn't have some of the marketing, dollars behind it to have a full race team just for that one obscure little model. Whereas, your Camaro or your Trans Am, your Pontiac were much more geared towards that. So
but here's what's funny about
popularity
that.
Into it.
But here's what's totally funny about that. During the 60s, General Motors pushed Pontiac harder than Chevrolet. You had your GTOs, you had your Le Mans, you had, even when the Firebird came out, as a pony car to compete with the Mustang. Yeah. GM pushed Pontiac more than they did the Camaro. Right. And that was kind of, and also too, look at it. Pontiac came with a 400 small block. It didn't have a 327. Right. So it was already kind of prepped up to be like that muscle car.
Here's the more, high-end version or the more, competitive version of the Camaro or of the thing. And
they made fewer of them.
And that's what's funny is that, we, what we consider to be the timeless muscle cars at the time maybe weren't considered that, or they were, but not as much as they are now, or as other things are. And that's the thing too, you know, we were talking about the GM, but Ford, you know, obviously the Mustang, you know, based on the Falcon,
right,
which was the secretary car.
Yes.
You know, that was always the kind of the joke or whatever at the time.
Right.
Guys like Carroll Shelby obviously got a hold of them, started doing the same recipe.
Yeah.
Turn them, you know, into more race and more competitive. But they had a full line of different, you know, muscle cars as well during that time.
Mercury.
Mercury,
you know,
one
that was
of the brands.
Yeah,
Lincoln
that was
Mercury.
You know, the thing about it was they looked at Ford built family cars. They knew that's where the money was at, and they knew that was the way. That's what they sold.
Yeah, that's your mass market. Yeah,
but they still had, you know, their other versions. Obviously, the Mustang did change a lot.
Yeah,
right. I mean, it started the pony car generation, or revolution, basically. But you know, Mercury, like they were known like the turnpike cruisers from the 50s. You had a bigger motor in a Mercury than you would a Ford. So it made sense for Mercury to come out with like a Cyclone. That made total sense.
Yeah.
You know, it was a mid-sized car, but it had the big motor in it. It had the big 428 in it, the Cobra Jet. That's another thing too. A lot of these engines, they took on a name of themselves, where the 428, 429 Cobra Jets, they could be found in not just Ford cars, but they were in Mercuries, they were in trucks. Well, not a lot of trucks, but you know, still that was like that was their NASCAR motor. Right. You look at the way that the 429 Boss motor, the way that the cylinder heads are laid over, or the valves laid over. It's laid over more in like a horizontal position. So it's got this giant head. So it's a Hemi Plus, right? It's got a hemispherical style of combustion, but the valve isn't on the top. It's off to the side. So it had this giant look to it. So it looked like a massive engine to it. So you would open the hood and go, oh my God, look at this thing.
Yeah.
And it's in this Mercury, like grandma's car.
No, and that's the same with like the Galaxy 500. I mean, I remember my grandparents had a Galaxy. You know, wasn't a muscle car to them, but
right.
You know, they had that, you know, that model, that edition of it.
Right. And in the 60s, you know, Ford did focus a lot on NASCAR. That was the, you know, race on Sunday, sell on Monday type thing. And you know, more of the other guys, like especially Chrysler, they went after drag racing like crazy. You're looking at like early Hemis through the mid 60s. You're looking at like a Belvedere that had a lightweight package. And what I mean by lightweight package, the trim, like the bumpers, instead of them being steel, they're made out of aluminum. So they actually, from the factory, they were like, hey, I know how to make this car go faster, lose weight, right? Yeah. Now, they don't make those in mass numbers, but believe me, a 64 Belvedere lightweight right now, the Barrett Jackson, bring me some money, right? But, you know, that again, too, obscure muscle car, because most guys would look at that and you'd think, oh, you know, if you start to think of a Chrysler muscle car, you're going to say Roadrunner, GTX, Barracuda, you know, that stuff. But look back at the Plymouth Belvederes and the what was the other version of it? Was it a Coronet? I think the Coronet was the Dodge version of the same car. And again, too, lightweight cars, but they were purpose built for drag racing. You know, they weren't your typical street-driven muscle car, right? Yeah,
or your just general kind of family,
exactly,
around town car,
right?
And even too, they, you know, we talked, and now I think this is the third time we've mentioned Camaro, Mustang, or maybe more than
a drinking game,
maybe more than that, yeah. So every time we mention the non-obscure muscle cars, you gotta take a drink. But there were, you know, your obscure or specialty versions of some of those that, you know, some of the dealerships, you know, would do their own editions, you know, the special ones where it had their own spin on it, so those are a little bit more rare or not as well known as just your straight up, you know, Camaro SS or something like that. So.
And I guess you could probably start with Carroll Shelby on that one.
And it's obviously, with the Mustang, you know, with the Falcon, but then, you had, you know, Don Yanko.
Yeah.
That Yanko Camaro, but also the
Yanko Nova, Yanko Chevelle. Well, not supposed to say Chevelle, but I mean,
we've already just said Mustang and Camaro. So
but I mean, and again, too, limited numbers.
Yeah.
So it was an obscure deal. You couldn't
to me, you know, I think a lot of people have probably heard, you know, the Yanko Camaro, and then you go, oh, they did a Yanko Chevelle as well. You're like, really?
Yeah. Like what?
I didn't know that.
Right.
So that's to say, so still the very popular muscle car, but a little bit more obscure version of them.
Yeah. And that's throughout the years too. I mean, you've seen restylers kind of throughout the years pick up a certain model car and go after it. I mean, you know, and I know we're saying again the pony car, but you look at like Mustang, how it started with Shelby, and it's gone through, you know, Steve Saleen, and then you've got Jack Roush versions.
Yeah.
So, you know, throughout the last 50 or 60 years, you've had people restyle those cars to make them more obscure as well, where they're not just a massive car. They're not just the
well, and
the
that's
Ford
the thing.
version.
It's you know, you walk in and want to buy a Mustang, you know, there's also, you know, 10 other people that are looking to buy that same Mustang.
Right.
You get a Saleen Mustang, you're one of those guys, right? You know, one of 100 or 1,000 that have that. So, you know, it's a little bit more specialty.
Right. So yeah, now also take a look at some other cars too that, you know, there are some of the, I want to say the grandma packages, like for example, Oldsmobile. Oldsmobile made a 442.
Yeah.
4-speed, 4-barrel, 2 positive traction rear end, 442. That's what it stands for.
I did not know that, actually.
Now, and also too, the Oldsmobiles, the 442s, they came with a W30 engine, 455, amazing torque monster.
That's the thing, because I honestly, because I'm not, you know, into the muscle car stuff as much, I thought the 442 was the engine size.
No.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that makes sense.
It stood for 4-speed, 4-barrel, 2 positive traction rear end.
Yeah,
is where that came from. And
two-wheel drive, essentially.
Two-wheel drive, basically, or positive traction, right? But I mean, that in that car too, it debuted at Indianapolis 500. So it wasn't the drag race. They already knew. GM already said, "Hey, we got a drag race deal going on. We also have another form of racing that's popular, Indian 500." Mm-hmm. You know, and those you get into some of those cars like a Hurst Olds, right? I mean, that's a serious, like a 1970 Hurst Olds 455 W30 package. Another big deal. I mean, that's something too, like that's a car you'd have to find on Hemmings, because that's something that would be very difficult to just find out of your local, you know.
Let's go on to Hemmings and see kind of what we could find without checking the box of Camaro, Chevelle, all of that stuff. Because there may be some muscle cars that are so obscure that we've never heard from or we're not, you know, thinking about.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the thing. So yeah, if I'm going on to Hemmings.com, let's see, let's go into the Hemmings auctions. And so obviously you got some, you know, live auctions that are happening right now. A couple of these are ending soon, so maybe we'll pick something up.
Right.
But I mean, yeah, you going for the live auctions, type of muscle cars. So we've got, just on this, we've got, you know, 13, cars, but that's for the live auction. We can go into the listings a little bit later. The very first one I'm seeing is a 1970 Ford Torino Cobra.
Okay. Yeah. So
the next two are Camaro, Challenger, GTO, Charger.
So what's that Torino GT?
Corvette, Challenger, Mustang.
Yeah.
So,
because what's that Torino GT going for?
Right now, $42,000. So
smoking deal.
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's a obscure muscle car, but a 429, you know, V8.
Is it grabber blue?
No, it's like red, orange.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always like the grabber blue ones.
Yeah, that is pretty nice, but super nice car. It's got, you know, their drag pack.
Yeah.
13-second car.
Yeah.
It's a rival to the Chevelles and the Hemis.
Yes.
This one's been restored to factory specs. And let's see. Yeah, let's kind of dive into this because, like I said, the Ford Torino.
Right.
Is
car that we don't even have anymore.
For sure. And was, you know, somewhat, you know, obscure even for the time a little bit.
Now that car though is pretty bitchin' though, because that car was
a really cool car.
That car was based off of a NASCAR deal. I mean, again, too, Ford was huge at that time into NASCAR. It wasn't the Grand Torino that you saw on Starsky and Hutch, because that comes later, right? But you know, because there's a lot of Torino guys that are into that. They love that old Starsky and Hutch red, and you know that was it was styled by George Barris, right?
Yeah.
But the early Torinos, the 70 Torinos, you know, those are the guys. Those are like the Buddy Baker is the guy I think of when I think of that car. Buddy Baker was an old NASCAR rival of Richard Petty, and he would beat up Richard Petty in his Charger.
So so the live auctions, first one we found was pretty rare, pretty obscure and different with the Torino.
Yeah.
So now here's the make an offer listings that they have. Pop in muscle cars, and we've got almost 800 cars that are available on the offer section.
Okay.
And of course, you can search it by, year, make, model, your price range, your all kinds of different stuff. But so yeah, we're going to go and see what we've got. Hey, we can get a Batmobile. I guess that's a muscle car.
I guess so.
But so I'm going to select AMC,
Okay.
Buick.
Okay.
Of course, Chevrolet has 327, but we're not
gonna,
we're not going to select that just yet.
Yeah.
De Tomaso.
Ooh.
Mercury.
Yeah.
Oops, that's Mustang. I've got about 134. So
Okay.
yeah, you mentioned the Oldsmobile 442.
Right.
Got an Oldsmobile Cutlass
Yeah.
Supreme. The AMC Javelin.
Ooh, I
is
forgot
one
about
thing that
Javelins.
you didn't mention. And
Yeah.
it's, very 70s muscle car,
Yes.
era styling. And, the Plymouth GTX.
Yeah.
Let's see what else. Buick Skylark.
That's right.
I mean, kind of looks like a Chevelle.
Well, and they
And
were.
a lot of them were,
That's
same as
a
what
body car.
happens now. Yeah. Same platform, different badging, different styling.
Right.
Wow, you've got a really flamed out CUDA. Okay.
Okay.
Obscure, maybe not in the model, but in the how it looks. But
Sure.
yeah, you got Mercury Cougar, Plymouth Duster,
Dodge Dart.
the Mercury, Cyclone GT.
Yeah.
Checking all those out. But there is something that's popping up a couple times that is one of my favorite cars, and I think we need to kind of dive into that and whether it fits the same definition of the muscle car. And it's on here, they're going for almost the highest price.
Okay.
Like you've got some Mopars that are at some high end, Buick Grand Nationals.
Ooh, we'll get into
So
that.
that's
yeah.
what I think we should start getting into on that. And what's pretty cool too is Hemmings has been doing a series recently of rebuilding and customizing a Grand National for the rapper Killer Mike.
Killer Mike, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
And
saw that.
he actually
Yeah.
drove it out at the Grammys.
Yeah.
So they've had a series going on, so you can check that out on Hemmings, and you can also, go check out the listings and find some obscure muscle cars that are pretty cool that maybe people aren't bidding on because they're not just typing in, Camaro or Mustang or something
Right.
like that. You're diving a little bit deeper, so you can do all that at Hemmings.com.
Yeah.
So if you go to beltec.com and put in the promo code AutoRevolution24, you're going to be getting one of these limited edition Cato House Beltec trucks on any order over $299. So basically all your lift kits, your lowering kits, your performance. This thing's slammed on some gold wheels. You've got a Beltec notch cover in the back. So if you go use AutoRevolution24, you get one of these. And for some of the smaller orders, they're going to be randomly selecting a winner to get some posters and calendars as well. So if you go online, use AutoRevolution24 at beltec.com. Now back to the show.
Okay, so GNs, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
GNs, to me, man, I can remember when they came out. The thing that was so crazy
What year
about
did they come out? Because it was the mid-'80s?
87.
86?
87.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And the thing that was what caught my eye to that car was, again, NASCAR was a big deal, and you had, Dale Earnhardt actually changed the color of his car that year from the Wrangler blue and yellow to the black. Obviously, he changed his. Richard Childress actually changed the sponsor. But the thing that really stood out to me was 1987. The fastest production car made was the Buick GNX. Now, we got to clarify what's the difference between a GN and a GNX.
Yeah.
Because your typical Grand National was based off of a Buick Regal T-Type, which they still make, or they made that car as well.
Yeah.
But the Grand National was a certain package. They were all black with a gray interior. Had the Grand National badging in the seats. It was a Buick V6, which again, too, that's another thing that we got to talk about. It wasn't a V8.
Yeah, but it was a V6
turbocharged-
with a turbo.
Turbocharged V6.
Yeah, so that's how they're making up that lack of displacement.
Exactly. But it was the fastest production car made in 1987. So it beat out your Corvettes. It beat out your Porsches. It beat out everything that was built in that year. So that was a big, plus for General Motors. Now, the GNX was a special package that had larger turbo, larger intercooler. It had different badging. You can always tell the difference by just looking at the front fender because it has the shark gills. And that's really the first thing that really is the difference between them. A lot of guys now call him Darth Vader. That's kind of the cliche name of it because it just looks mean going down the road. But they were a limited production model vehicle that was built back there, and they were only built, I want to say, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
right?
No, and the great styling, pretty, pretty good for being based on a Buick Regal that you'd think of as your grandma's car or a lowrider.
True.
It's kind of like the two directions to go.
Yeah.
But it just looks mean. Like I said, all black.
It was a statement car. It was a total statement
and that's
car.
the thing. We're saying, okay, what's the definition of a muscle car? So that doesn't qualify being a V6.
Yeah.
But like you said, it was the fastest car that year.
Right.
So it had enough power. It had the same amount of power. But let's look up some of those numbers.
Right. I can specifically remember a guy that bought 2 of them.
And so the Buick Grand National, 276 horsepower.
Right.
So, it's not necessarily your larger, muscle car, things like we're talking about with, that are 300 plus, but for the time period for the 80s,
Yeah.
that, that was it. That did it.
Yeah.
So, and that's the thing. It's still your 2-row family car, 2 doors, had the T-top, T-tops on it. So same as that was very 80s muscle car.
Yeah. I mean, I can remember a specific guy that we grew up around that he bought 2 of them, and he would drive around the GN during the day and let people see him in the GN, thinking like that's the only car he had. Then he would try to line up street races for later in the night, and he would show up in his GNX. So it was like, we know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like you're not fooling anybody. But it was kind of funny for him to know, like, this is how I'm going to pimp races.
Yeah.
I'm going to drive around and try to get people to run me. And street racing was a big thing back then, and it still is today in some sorts. But, that was kind of that guy's job. The funny thing about it was I never knew his real name. He only went by the word forehead.
I'm guessing he had a large forehead.
Yes.
All right.
A little bit of trivia.
But yeah, so just put in perspective a little bit, like we were talking about the Regal. The engine in that was 125 horsepower.
Right.
So
Your Honda Civic.
In a 4.1 liter V6. So
yeah,
you had to add a turbo or something else to get to any respectable muscle car level of power, which now that number's pretty dismal, but like I said, for the time and to me, like I said, I think the styling of it is something that's very iconic and screams your 1980s muscle car.
Oh, it totally does.
Because like you had the Camaros, all right, take a shot. The IROC Camaro. You had some of the Z28. You still had that being built and done, and they were popular, obviously.
They were totally popular. Yeah.
If you want to go for the obscure one, go for the Buick.
And if you wanted to go fast, go see Kenny Duttweiler.
Yeah, he was the king of those motors and really dialing those in. And of course, what's funny now is you see, guys like Roadster Shop doing a 1500 horsepower version of it.
But the thing's amazing looking.
Yeah.
And it just looks effortless how he just hazes the tires at like 40 miles an hour. He just kind of stands on the throttle and the thing just lights the tires up. So they're badass. They're a great looking car.
So and the other brands had kind of similar obscure trying to hold on to the muscle car stuff a little bit in the 80s because obviously a lot of guys had the old muscle cars, and that was 80s was huge for muscle cars. Cruising down the boulevard or burning the tires, but OEM, manufacturers, obviously there's a gas crisis in the 70s, kind of killed the muscle cars. But, obviously the popular stuff was still going around. You had the Fox Body Mustangs, but there were versions, by Mercury.
That's right.
That was based on that same Mustang platform.
The Capri. Yeah. Which the Capri, what's funny is the Capri it started out as the British version of Ford, like the Cosworth guys and everything.
Yeah.
And they had like kind of a simple little car that was only built in Europe, but they imported it into the United States in the mid 70s. And it was like a 2-liter, small little kind of car, stick shift, just a commuter.
Your standard European.
Right. But when they brought on the Fox body style back in '82, of course they made the Ford version being the Mustang, and then the Mercury version they just adopted the Capri name to that. So you still had all of the amenities of the Ford version, but it was just a different name badge.
Yeah, it was under, you'd buy it at a Lincoln Mercury dealership
Right.
instead of the Ford delership.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, another car that kind of comes to mind that maybe they tried too hard, and this was, I'm going to say a little bit later in the 70s, though. It wasn't 80s yet. This is like, you know, like 78, 79. Oldsmobile had the Rally 300. And I remember this because there was a yellow one where I grew up, and it looked like somebody just put a sticker pack on a car. You know, like I even being a younger kid, I knew the car was slow. But
it looked fast.
Yeah, it was like one of those like, wow, it looks kind of cool.
Each sticker adds 5 horsepower.
And that was it. Yeah. So a lot, you know, and that was the problem is in
they're
the 70s,
faking the funk.
Well, they had to, because in the 70s with the fuel embargo and
the
obviously
EPA
the EPA
and
the Clean Air Act, it kind of killed a lot of that, you know, being able to have a nice
The
muscle
raw
car.
muscle car.
Right. So, but people still wanted it. So like you even had like, and here I go again, get ready for your drink. Even the disco Camaros, like a 79 Z28 has like 100 and something horsepower, but it looks cool.
Yeah.
You know, but it
Well,
just,
and that's, I mean, yeah, it kind of got to the point of a lot of the Camaros, you know, the Mustangs were probably more selling V6 versions of them than the V8.
Oh, absolutely.
Of them at that time. So,
well, think of late 70s. We're talking Smokey and the Bandit comes out.
yeah.
Right. And
Pontiac.
obviously Pontiac lent them the Trans Ams. They talked them into it, you know, which I thought was kind of funny, because Pontiac back then was like still looking for that. Hey, are we a family car? Or are we,
what's our market?
You know, what is our
target?
market? So in comes this movie that just changed the freaking whole, you know, outlook on a brand, you know, and those cars too. Like when the third gen car came out, you know, again, GM pushed the Pontiac name more than they did the Chevrolet name. So there were a lot more Trans Ams and Firebirds in '82 than there were the Z28s and the IROCs.
Camaros, yeah.
You know, so that you know, and then let's also look at that third gen deal. I want to say the '89 Pontiac Trans Am is like the most aerodynamic car that General Motors ever built. There's a specific model called a Turbo Trans Am. It's not a GTA. It's a Turbo Trans Am from '89.
But I mean, it does make sense that, because that was the time period where aerodynamics, computer, model, you know, being able to really engineer and get scientific,
exactly,
you know, on the aerodynamics of it.
Right.
What did you say it was?
It was an '89 Pontiac Trans Am, Turbo Trans Am, and that was allegedly like the most time ever in the wind tunnel and the best engineering that General Motors ever did. So, and they hold a ton of records. I mean, you go out to land speed records, and there's a ton of them.
Got a turbo V6,
and it's got a turbo V6 in it, right?
So yeah, taking the page out of the Buick Grand National,
right?
But yeah, and I mean, and that's, you've got all the fairings, you got the side, you know, skirts, you got all that, and it, I mean, hey, it was 300 horsepower,
right?
Or 245.
245. Okay. Okay. I was gonna say 300 would be a big. 300 is usually now the.
But
average
that's
for your
here's the
V6.
thing. 1989.
Yeah.
Chevy Corvette C4.
Yeah.
240 horsepower.
Right.
1989.
Yeah.
Pontiac Firebird Trans Am.
Right.
V6.
Yeah.
245 horsepower.
Right. So it makes the same horsepower.
Same horsepower.
But it has 2 less cylinders.
2 less cylinders, but with the turbo.
Right.
But yeah, they only made 1,500 of those.
Yeah.
So super
great car to pick up.
Super rear. I mean, looks really cool. I mean, obviously they used that as, you know, the pace car for that year for Indy.
Obviously, yeah.
But no, I mean, that's kind of what some of that era was figuring out how can we still have a muscle car but be compliant, you know, with the things. But then obviously as technology, as, you know, electric, you know, EFI fuel injection, all that started to come in to play, the kind of the muscle cars started to come back.
Exactly. Well, you know, the real resurgence, I think, of the muscle car coming back is 2005, the Ford Mustang.
Yeah. And that was, because that was definitely a turning point.
Yeah.
And, you know, they were capitalizing a lot on the baby boomer generation.
Exactly.
Being that those the Mustang was the car to have. That was the iconic car.
Right.
So it had that styling from the 60s, or probably more like the late 60s of the fastbacks.
Yeah.
And then obviously Chevy reintroduced the Camaro, you know, 5 years later, 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
And that had some of the same similar styling, but yeah, you started to have those with the larger engines, you know, in them, the LS powered or the Coyotes, stuff like that. But
look at Chrysler. Chrysler like took a nap for decades.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the fuel embargo of 73, 74 hurt Chrysler big time. I mean, they went off the map. And they went into small economy cars, obviously your K series cars, Lee Iacocca, you know, that kind of stuff happens throughout the 80s. The 90s were kind of relying on Mitsubishi to build their muscle cars with they had the Dodge Daytonas. You know, it's kind of obscure stuff, but that was all private label. It wasn't Dodge or Chrysler the ones developing that stuff. Now in comes this, you know, 2005 kind of resurgence of the muscle car, and they jump right on board. They introduced the Charger. They introduced the Challenger. They bring back the Hemi.
Yeah.
You know, they brought
that was the whole,
Hemi, right?
Huge marketing campaign. Deal. I mean, like I said, now we're bringing up some mullets and some
totally.
Joe Dirt and Dierte
yes.
And stuff like that. But yeah, that thing got a Hemi.
Yep.
That was, and they applied that Hemi into other vehicles and stuff too that were a little bit larger, you know, your Chrysler 300 or the trucks and stuff like that. So it was just more power to a lot of those.
Because I mean, if you look at 2000, the lineup of 2004 and 5 at Chrysler was their production car that went fast was a Viper.
Yeah.
Right. Like
which was horrible to kind of drive and own and all that. But
sorry, Viper people, but but I mean, then you look at 2006
and that was V12. I mean, that was.
Well, they have the V10s.
V10, sorry. But yeah, they're trying to compete with the Ferraris or the Lambos, the
that's
exotic
supercars.
Right. They were trying to compete, you know, into that, but they also took that V10, put it into a truck.
They did. And man, they did good burnouts.
I've seen some, and I've even
I've done some,
and I've even put a fire extinguisher on some things on a V10. Jay La Rosa, if you're watching this.
Yes.
You know, and that's the muscle truck. Yeah, they had some of that stuff, but the muscle trucks started to become popular. And so it's, hey, we're talking about muscle cars, but want to go obscure, get a truck. Still 2 doors.
And here's another thing too.
Still 2 doors.
Still 2 doors and a back seat. If you look at the Chevy Silverado SS. 6.0, all-wheel drive. It's got front and a back seat.
And
a 6-foot bed that never's got to be made.
And GM even, you know, earlier than that was kind of taking the cues from the Buick Grand National, the Trans Am with the V6 turbo, and putting that into a truck, putting that into an SUV, you know, with the Cyclone and the Typhoon and stuff.
God, I forgot completely about those. You're right.
No, and so that's what I was saying. So like the truck side, if you want to talk obscure muscle car, go for a truck then.
Yeah.
But there were still some oddball ones, like, you know, the Ford Thunderbird. You know, they had a supercharged version.
Did. That's right. The SC Coupe.
You know, and it is a 4-door, but I'm going to mention. No. I'm saying.
Okay.
But it is kind of cool, and also because it's Conan O'Brien's dream car, and he's owned it since the 90s, but the Ford Taurus Show, the SHO, you know, it's got 4 doors.
Yes.
But it's everything else on it is built to be a muscle car.
Yes.
Because that's one of the things too in the 90s, especially even later, and now 4-door sedans, you know, and now 4-door trucks are kind of the norm.
Right.
You know, that they've taken over a lot of, you know, there's not as many of the 2-door coupes out there. I mean, obviously, the Mustang, the Dodge Challenger, you know, but the Dodge Charger
is
had 4 doors.
Yeah, right.
You know, unless you work at West Coast Customs and you turn it into 1 door, you know, exactly. 1 door on each side.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also take a look. You mentioned the show. You know, if you're going to mention a 4-door mid-90s muscle car, then you can't forget the Impala SS.
Yeah.
You know, and again, too, a lot of people say it's got too many doors. You know, but I will tell you from experience with the Whipple Supercharger, they go 140 miles an hour in Vegas, and you can make it there in 2 hours and 45 minutes. So
you can also
they're fast.
You can also do that with an SRT Chrysler 300.
That's true.
I don't necessarily know this personally.
Right. Allegedly. But okay, now if we're getting into that kind of thing, let's talk about Jeep Cherokee Trackhawks.
True.
Right? Because those things, with a few mods, they're a 10-second grocery getter.
Literally grocery getter. Like you could go to Costco in that thing.
You could put a flat of water in it and go to the track and still put down a 10-second time slip, and they're fast.
Yeah. Well, and Cadillac kind of, they were the luxury car, in the 50s, the 60s.
Right.
Kind of turned into the grandpa car.
Yeah.
By the time the 2000s rolled around and kind of the resurgence of muscle cars and horsepower, Cadillac really kind of dove after that. I mean, obviously they kept the luxury stuff.
Yeah.
They had the Escalades that were your luxury SUVs, but they came out the CTSV, edition.
Right.
And they did have a two-door coupe version
they did.
for the longest time of that.
Right.
So definition of muscle car, same engine as the Corvette.
That's right.
With a supercharger on it.
I think LSAs, right?
Yeah, so the LSAs, 6.2 with a supercharger.
Yeah.
I mean,
mean.
Yeah. And full interior,
Yeah.
luxury, AC, heated, probably,
Everything.
toenail,
Right.
heaters or something like
Right.
that. But so that's, kind of what, now is funny is you look at almost any car, any vehicle, it's probably got the same, if not more horsepower than a muscle car did back in the day.
Your V6 Camaro right now.
Yeah.
Or let's just say Mustang, because Camaros are being phased out. But your 2024 Mustang standard, EcoBoost V6 car makes more horsepower than your 454 Chevelle from 1970. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's 450 horsepower.
No, but it makes 315 horsepower.
Yeah, exactly.
So we were just talking about how the Corvette in 1989 made 245 horsepower.
Right.
So now your 2.3 liter.
Right.
So half the liter.
Yes.
Is taking that same book from the Buick Grand National, the V6 turbo.
Right.
And obviously they did a lot of that for the fuel economy.
Yeah.
They were kind of forced to do.
Sure.
But yeah, it makes 350 foot-pounds of torque and 315 horsepower. And I do know on those EcoBoost, put a little tuning in it.
Oh, 100 horsepower.
You can get another extra 70, 80, 100 horsepower added to it. So now you're talking about a V6 factory car potentially reaching 400 horsepower and even more torque. That completely eclipses any muscle car from the 60s.
Exactly. One other obscure one I have to bring up, and I know it kind of, again, falls in the truck category, which we're heavy in, but we're forgetting about the 454 SS truck. Mm-hmm.
Which, of course, let's go back to how many, talking horsepower.
Like 215 or something crazy. And it's a 454, so
big block.
7.4 liters, big block.
What you'd see more or less in the dualies or the big, 3/4 tons and stuff like that. And so you actually undersold it a little bit.
Okay.
So
220.
So you made 290.
290.
Yeah.
Wow.
290 horsepower.
Wow. 7.4
so that
liters,
was
huh?
that was the later Vortec version.
I was just gonna say
so the 454
TBI
so the 454 SS in 1990 had 255 horsepower.
Wow.
So for the time period, being that the Corvette makes 245, if you're making a little more than the Corvette guy,
right,
you're a big deal.
And you're passing everything but the gas station.
And that's it too. Because you literally have a boat engine anchor in the front.
Yeah.
So, and obviously, that had, lowered suspension, the styling was a little bit cooler, a little bit nicer. So it was your muscle truck for the time. But you compare that to any modern muscle car or modern car in general.
Right.
We've got way more power.
Yeah.
And that's not even going into the EV stuff because, obviously now you've got an EV Mustang, that's out there and you're talking instant torque, instant power. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see like what will be considered a muscle car going forward.
Exactly.
You know, if the definition of mid-sized, two-door, and large power,
Right.
you know, just remove V8 from the equation, but large power, well, I mean, it's kind of everything. So does that mean then now it's got to be over 500 or 600 horsepower?
I know.
You know, what's the threshold? What's the change?
Well, and also too, you're looking at
for a muscle car.
Yeah, because now we do have numbers. We have the 700s, we have the 800s. I mean, we're pushing even 1,000 horsepower in some of these production cars.
Yeah.
But also too, there's other players that are coming in that are taking muscle car events by storm that are not even American cars. I mean, look at a Nissan GT, look at
GTR.
Look at a GTR.
Yeah.
I mean, those things.
You can beat
everything.
You can beat
right?
any.
And if you're looking at like people like, for example, the One Lap of America race that we talked about in another episode, the last 10 years, it's been won by a GTR in a row, right? So other companies have stepped up their game to enter that muscle car range, which, we kind of always call an American car a muscle car. But you look at some of those European cars or some of those Japanese cars that are just absolutely dominating.
Yeah. So, well, and that's the thing I think still fits. Yeah, the GTR being, it's coupe
and it's still got 4 seats.
Exactly. Yeah. So it fits that, definition, but Pontiac brought the GTO back.
That's right.
Well,
Holden, but yeah.
Well, it was based on the Holden Australian kind of design, but for the States, Pontiac GTO, same engine as, the Corvette and, all that kind of had. And that was kind of the bridge the gap of years of the Camaro, not being out from, from early 2000s till Camaro 5th gen came out in 2010.
Yeah.
But for the modern muscle time period, that is a little bit of an obscure thing. Because we credit the GTO as being the first muscle car of what we consider a muscle car.
Right.
But when it came back, it was a little bit underground. It wasn't, like I said, but that was the same time period that the Mustang was coming back.
Yeah. And those cars are deadly. Those things, a 6.0 stick shift GTO, like 2005, 2006. I think it's like the last year's 2006. Yeah. You look at those cars and you think rental car. You don't think those things being fast, but let it start up and you're like, wow, what's that? There's something to mess with.
And have a lot of power.
Yeah.
But that, you can buy a muscle car with over 1,000 horsepower from the dealership.
Yeah.
So compare that to what horsepower was the Pontiac GTO?
From what year?
The first.
64?
64. Do you want to guess?
I'm going to say...
It's pretty decent.
I was going to say it's probably closer to 300 horse. Maybe 325 horse.
325.
Yeah, because you're talking, that's probably a Pontiac 389 tri-pack.
Tri-power, yep.
Yeah. So I'm going to say probably about 325.
Yeah. So 325. So that's solid.
That's a solid number.
Pretty solid, power on that.
But that's a V6 today.
But that's a V6 today. So, the horsepower wars, kind of really got their start with the muscle car stuff. And it's continued through today. Because like I said, you got Dodge, Hellcats and stuff with 700 plus horsepower. You got your Demon Scat Pack, special key, get you over 1,000.
Your Mustang Dark Horses now.
Yeah. That's your 700 plus, horsepower. And then of course you've got your builder, your custom builder guys, your engine builders, your Duttweilers, your, Nelson Racing engines that
Don
are doing
Hardy, all those. Yeah.
Doing twin turbo LS setups.
Crate ordered 1,000 horsepower shows up at your house.
1,500 horsepower, 2,000 horsepower.
It's insane.
So I think for the next episode, let's kind of look and dive into just the chase for that horsepower number, both on the OEM side and on the custom, race side of it of, okay, how many horses can you put on the street legally? So I think the next one, let's start diving into horsepower wars.